had an amazing session yesterday with Sheikh Fahad Taslim, so he's back again. So if you support him again, he'll be back again, inshallah. And then we'll just kidnap him and, and never return him to his family in Cyprus, which is in a different planet, mashallah. Huh? Climb, subhanallah. Did you pray Qasr? Yeah? So, alhamdulillah, we had an amazing program yesterday. It was something even awe-inspiring for me, mashallah. Many people stayed back till 11 o'clock, but almost like 80, 90 people stayed back till 11 o'clock. I see a lot of new faces today, and inshallah, many more will trickle in. Sisters, if you're in the back, please do come forward. We have seating in the front for you. And before we begin, inshallah, you know, the scholars, they say, and this is a haqiqi, kalamullah is greater than kalamun nas. And so inshallah we're going to begin with our beloved brother Tariq, who gave the most amazing iqama I have ever heard in a very long time, mashallah. JazakAllahkhair.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. والفجر والفجر وليال عشر والشفع والوتر والليل إذا يسر هل في ذلك قسم لذي حجر ألم تر كيف فعل ربك بعاد إرم ذات العماد التي لم يخلق مثلها في البلاد وثمود الذين جابوا الصخر بالواد وفرعون ذي الأوتاد الذين طغوا في البلاد فأكثروا فيها الفساد فصب عليهم ربك سوط عذاب إن ربك لبالمرصاد فأما الإنسان إذا ما ابتلاه ربه فأكرمه ونعمه فيقول ربي أكرمن وأما إذا ما ابتلاه فقدر عليه رزقه فيقول ربي أهانن كلا بل لا تكرمون اليتيم ولا تحاضون على طعام المسكين وتأكلون التراث أكلا لما وتحبون المال حبا جما كلا إذا دكت الأرض دكا دكا وجاء ربك والملك صفا صفا وجيء يومئذ بجهنم يومئذ يتذكر الإنسان وأنى له الذكرى يقول يا ليتني قدمت لحياتي فيومئذ لا يعذب عذابه أحد ولا يوثق وثاقه أحد يا أيتها النفس المطمئنة ارجعي إلى ربك راضية مرضية فادخلي في عبادي وادخلي جنتي. جزاكم الله خيرا.
ما شاء الله. الله أكبر. Okay, بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم أما بعد. So before I jump into what we're going to be speaking about tonight, if I could get just by a show of hands, who was here yesterday for last night's session? I just want to, okay. Okay, good. So what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to just review a little bit about what we did last night, okay? I'm not going to get into all of it, but let me just start by saying I recognize last night was very, very dense, right? So Tonight, I'm promising you, inshallah, that it's going to be lighter, and inshallah, you'll find it a little more enjoyable, inshallah, okay? So just as a review, yesterday, we had spoken about the concept of worldviews, and we said that a worldview simply is, well, what's a worldview? Instead of me just talking. Yeah. The way you view the world, right? So everyone's like, what, it was dense yesterday? How was it? This doesn't seem that complicated, right? So basically, it's the lenses by which you view the world, the lenses by which you view reality, okay? And we had a brief discussion about how the term deen within the Islamic context, to simply translate it as religion, may be a faux pas, may be a problem in certain circumstances, right? We'll get into that discussion a little bit tonight as well, time permitting, bi'idhnillah. But generally, a worldview is how you view the world. So if I was to have glasses which had green lenses, and you have glasses that have red lenses, and we went outside and I was trying to convince you that the tree that you're looking at is in fact green, and you're looking at it through red lenses, you would never be convinced that it would be a green tree, right? So we mentioned that just like that, every single person has a worldview. How do you view reality? And the thing is, there is no one that is worldview-less. Everyone has a paradigm and a worldview by which they view reality, which they view, concepts like truth and so on and so forth. And so therefore, someone cannot say, I can transcend my worldview and come from sort of central location where I have an unbiased opinion about things. That's a complete untrue statement. And we compared the concept of a worldview to like that of a language. Every person speaks a language. You cannot be language-less, right? Now, it doesn't necessarily mean we're talking about sounds that are articulated, but you even think in a certain language. So everyone has a language. Similarly, everyone has a direction in which they face. We had a discussion yesterday about the qibla and things like that. No one can say, oh, I'm directionless. I can face neutral direction, like no direction. No, everyone, whether you're asleep or awake or alive or dead, whatever, you are going to be facing a certain direction. You cannot be directionless. So just like that, every single person has a worldview. And then we got into the components of a worldview. What is a worldview made out of? And we kind of spent a little bit of time on the slide you see up here. So we started off by saying that one of the first questions, one of the first components of a worldview is what we call ontology. What exists? Do I exist? Does this masjid exist? Does the tree outside exist? Okay? So depending on your answer to that question, and how you get to that answer, is going to be part and parcel of your worldview. A fundamental part of ontology about what exists is, does God exist? And based on your answer about whether God exists or not, then you would have a theology, which you'll notice up there is above ontology, because obviously Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is above everything and so on and so forth. But then you can only speak about a theology, in other words, who or what is God, what are the characteristics of God, so on and so forth, if you've answered that ontological question first. What exists? Does God exist? All right. The next part, a component of a worldview is epistemology. How do you know X, Y, and Z exists? What are your sources of knowledge? Are your sources of knowledge only this temporal world? Or are they also revelation? Is it Quran and Sunnah, or is it just this temporary world? So that's what we call the study of knowledge, the epistemology. Then you have anthropology. Who or what is the human being? Are we just material matter? Or do we have a soul? And if we're just material matter, then we have certain philosophical quagmires that become very problematic to answer, right? Which we spoke about yesterday, in terms of human valuation. If you say we're just material matter, we don't have a soul, then therefore valuation about me being more valuable than this mic becomes problematic, right? So if you were to break this mic, or whether you were to break me in half, it would be the same thing from a valuation point of view. But anyway, so we said anthropology is about who or what is the human being. Then we asked the question about teleology. Is there a purpose? Does the universe have a purpose? Do I have a purpose? Does my life have meaning? Or is it all just meaningless? Is the universe meaningless? Then what we said is the question of morality and ethics, which is what most people basically debate about. All right? That's better. All right, can everyone hear me? All right, good. So morality and also depend upon, I actually said it was better without it. No, it just went on mute. It went on mute, okay. All right, should I just have a distance from it? Is that better? Yes, no? Okay. So your opinion about an issue like abortion, it's not just something that you can take in a vacuum, right? Unless you understand those things that precede a moral question, you will argue till you're blue in the face, okay? Why? Because it goes back to my example of glasses. You are arguing with someone who has a different set of lenses than you. So if you haven't resolved the issues or you haven't agreed upon those things that come before the moral and ethical issue you're debating, you're not going to come to any sort of agreement, right? But what you'll notice, and this is what we said yesterday, is on that slide, you have a certain kind of order of importance that goes with the gradation of the color. So you notice the darkest things are on top, ontology and epistemology. Epistemology, how do you know what you know? How do you determine something to be true? What are the tools you're going to use? Is it just the mind? Is there something more than the mind? Is it rationality? Are there other things, other tools we can use? And so what you'll find is that as the color gradation gets lighter and lighter, you find an order of importance in terms of what determines a worldview. On the lowest end, in fact, morality and ethics comes very far down the list of what determines a worldview. And then we spoke about morality and ethics has a bearing on law and politics. Before you can say we're going to go and vote for X, Y, and Z person, well, you need to have a grounding in morality and ethics. What are your morality and ethics? But before you get to that, there has to be clarity about what exists, what does not exist. How do you know something to be true? Who or what is the constitution of the human being, right? Is there a purpose, and so on and so forth. And finally, I mentioned aesthetics. Your very conceptualization, what you consider beautiful. And so we had the example yesterday about art. When I say the word art, what comes to mind? And yesterday, because I'm not going to repeat the exercise, yesterday, most of the people said, oh, I was thinking about visual art. In the sense that, okay, paintings, movies, cinema. But what's interesting is that perception of the word art to go immediately to visual arts is a part of the worldview you find yourselves in. Because in fact, it's a throwback to a Christian concept that has to do with elevating the visual arts, elevating the human art, the painting of the human being, right? Why? Because from a Christian worldview, the word becomes flesh. And so therefore, if the word becomes flesh, all of your aesthetics and art is dependent, is going to be delineated by way of your worldview, which from that perspective is a biblical worldview, right? Which trickles down to our modern world. From an Islamic worldview, however, when we think about art, and when we tease it out, we find that in fact the visual art, the ocular sensation, is not the primary, but that's not the first thing we go to when we think about art, when we think about aesthetics. The primary thing we go to, which is based on our worldview, has to do with the auditory, the listening, the recitation of the Quran, the beauty of the recitation. Our brother just recited it, so there's an appreciation of that beauty. Things like poetry, and so on and so forth. And we understand, as we mentioned yesterday, the immense amount of emphasis that's placed on language, that in the modern worldview, you don't have that sort of emphasis on language. So that was just a brief summary of what we did yesterday. We also spoke deeply about the fitrah. What does that mean? How do we define it, and so on and so forth. So you'll have to, talk to me later or something, and we can get into that. But from that point of view, what I want to do was, I wanted to actually tease this concept out by way of a thought experiment, okay? Because I didn't want to just keep speaking, and then everyone's like, okay, so what does ontology mean again? And then we're just, So here's what I wanted to do. I wanted to look at an issue, and an issue that's not so controversial, because I did this with a relatively controversial issue, which was feminism, and I got into a little bit of trouble in Delaware. So I'm going to leave that one alone for now, okay? So we'll talk about another issue, and that issue is something we call wealth distribution, redistribution, all right? So whatever your political leanings may be, you may have a certain opinion about, let's say, the rich having and accumulating all of the wealth that they have, right? So who's the richest person in the world right now? Does anyone know? Is it Jeff Bezos? Elon Musk. Okay, so maybe they're neck to neck, right? So from what I recall, like this is maybe like 10-year-old data, there used to be a time when Bill Gates was the richest person in the world, right? And so what they said about Bill Gates, or what they said about Bill Gates was that he was so rich, they wanted to actually calculate how much he would earn per hour. And so when they ran the calculations, they found that Bill Gates earned, like if you take about 14 hours a day from the time he started Microsoft all the way until whatever, 2012, whenever the study was done, they said between that time period, if you did the calculations, about 14 hours a day, he would earn $100, not an hour, not even in a minute, $100 a second. So in reality, if he was walking by and he found a $100 note on the floor, it wouldn't be worth his time to even pick it up, okay? So basically that's how rich he was. So now the question we want to tease out is this: is it okay, is it fair for the government to tax Bill Gates, let's say at a 50% rate? So let me get some hands here. How many people think it would be okay if the government said, look, 50%, you don't have enough time to spend all that money, right? And so for the government to come and tax you at 50%, think about all the social services, all of the poor, everyone that could be uplifted. So how many people would agree with a policy like that? Okay, good. How many people would disagree with that? 1, 2, 3, okay. So you have some people, so the people who agree, raise your hands. Just for a second, I just want to get another, okay, and the people that disagree, raise your hands again. Okay, let me start. Why do you disagree? Wait. So, we're talking about worldview. We have to keep the Islamic worldview out for a second. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier, right? So I'm not saying Islamically do you disagree. I'm saying, imagine if you're like a secular worldview or a modern worldview like we spoke about yesterday. How would you justify it? Okay. Okay, so you're saying that it would not be just because he earned that money, fair and square. Is that what you're saying? Why should they tax him more? But he has so much, right? That's what someone may argue. Okay, who's in favor of taxing him? Okay, on this side, how would you respond to him? Okay, but then back to his point, is that fair though? Is that just? Well, before we get to a socialist, I'm asking just, is it fair? Before we... Wait. Let's get hands, because I don't want... So, Sheikh Ahmed. Sure.
Then either you have equity or you don't have equity.
Okay.
You can't just that's just what I'm thinking out loud.
Okay.
That why is it that Brother Ihtisham would get taxed more and Imam Ahmed gets taxed less?
Okay.
It's because we earn differently, but maybe I'm just sitting at home and Brother Ihtisham is grinding 24 hours a day.
Sure. So your argument is, or you're basically saying, is that Brother Ihtisham might be working harder and therefore earning more money, and so why should he be taxed? Is that what you're saying?
Why should he be taxed more than you?
More than you.
Yeah.
Okay, so when we say more than you, are we talking, like if we said 50% across the board, would it be okay then? Yeah. So someone that earns, let's say, $40,000 a year only gets to take home $20,000, whereas Bill Gates, who wouldn't even stop for a $100 bill because it's not worth his time, and he gets taxed 50%. Would it be the same? Okay, wait. Okay, why is it unfair? Sorry? Okay. Yeah. Okay, so you're saying as long as there's a progressive tax. Okay. Okay. Okay, before we get into the weeds about savings tax, income tax, right? I don't want to get, what we want to tease out is the morality of the issue. Because again, we're looking at it from a worldview perspective. Yes? Okay. Okay. Sure. Okay. Okay, but so let's look at it from a different perspective, right? And here's where I'll play, I don't want to say devil's advocate, but I'm just going to go on the, just given a justification. Oh, you didn't hear what she said? All right. I'm going to need to, so say it again, but try to just summarize it. Sure. Okay. Sure. Right. So basically you're saying that, look, it's also not only the work, but it's the quality of the work. Someone's working 20, 30 hours, or the labor itself, right? So Bill Gates sitting in an air-conditioned office, you know, so-and-so is working out on some sort of manual labor job, so it's not really fair. Let me just mention something. So in political philosophy, in this question about justice, you find there's many schools that kind of try to tease out concepts of justice, okay? So one of those schools is what we call the libertarian school, libertarianism. So I'm not talking about the political party. I'm talking about the actual, you know, political philosophy known as libertarianism. And so they are against the very concept of taxation entirely, all right? Now, how do they justify that, though? And in fact, they're very, very ardent. They say, look, when I work for my money, right, if the government taxes me, it means that part of my labor, whatever that labor may be, whether it's in an air-conditioned office or if it's, you know, so they're against taxation in its entirety. So they say whatever that labor might be, the fact that the government can force me to pay part of my income, it's like saying the government can take some of my labor and forcefully take it from me. Okay? So how is it fair if I have earned the money, and they have two basic conditions. They say, as long as it was earned in a way that I have not trampled on the rights of somebody else, and number two, it was part of the free market. Okay, these are the two conditions. If it was earned in a way that was fair, part of the law, and it was part of a free market, so therefore, if the government's gonna tax me, if they tax me anything, then it's like I've done labor at the behest of the government. And if you stretch the kind of, if you stretch the moral argument here, it's saying that it's a type of slavery. Because what the government is doing is taking labor that I've done and basically taking a part of that and forcing me to work and give up the fruits of my labor. All right? So that's the libertarian argument. All right? So how many people would agree with that argument, just as on the logic of it? Okay, 1, 2, anybody else? Nobody else. All of a sudden the dynamic has changed. All right, those two hands that came up, where were you? You have one, okay. So, number one, what would, the people that disagree with that, what's your name, by the way? Bilal. What would you tell Bilal? So I want to hear from the people that would disagree with that line of reasoning. What would you tell Bilal here? Why is it wrong? Yes. Actually, can I give you the mic? Because I don't want to repeat the...
I mean, just to be transparent about this, in order to accumulate that much amount of money, you would have to trample on someone. I don't think you can fairly earn a whole bunch of money because of that. So, I don't know. I know that kind of falls off that concept, but yeah.
All right, Bilal, what's your response, man? She said, yeah, by necessity, if you make that money, you have to trample on someone.
I totally disagree, because there's a set of ethics and morals, and if everyone is ethics and morals, and if society as a whole is following set of morals and ethics, then you are not trampling over anyone's right. It's fair and square game.
Wait, who wants to respond to Bilal? Okay.
So I think, when you make a certain amount of money, you have an obligation, as a moral obligation, to give back to people, like let's say poor, the needy, the orphans, or the widows. So I think if the government taxes you, I think it's very fair. If you make a certain amount of money, it should be reasonable, and we can decide on what is reasonable. But I think you have to be taxed in order for the government to run, for the funds, for the police, for the army. So I think taxes, to an extent, is fair.
You want to respond?
I think the question is whether the government can force you to give taxes. I think that's my concern. And you can talk about so different things, whether government can make money out of its own business and support all kinds of programs. I mean, that's one sense you can voluntarily give. This is different than whether the government can force you to pay. That's what I disagree.
Right. We'll do. Does anyone want to do? We'll do 2 more responses. So, anyone want to respond? You want to respond? Actually, let me get a sister to do it because I don't want to be unfair here. Yeah.
Well, I was just thinking that it doesn't hurt him, the amount of money that he has, for him to give away a portion of it. It doesn't hurt him as much as it would hurt somebody who has less amount of money. So, logically, I don't see why he wouldn't give it away, because it doesn't take away from his quality of life at all, but it would help somebody else's quality of life.
Let's give a last response to that. Let me just hand it. What was your name again? Sorry. Nathan.
So this all comes back to a question of fairness and morals, right? So the question is the person taxing Bill Gates more or less ethical than Bill Gates is also, I think, a part of the question. Because Bill Gates is not in charge of, like, the US military. But at the same time, a rich person knows more knowledge about tax loopholes, so effectively not paying some of those taxes to begin with. Whereas a poor person might not be able to afford that advice, so it's sort of unfair in that regard as well. A little bit, but at the same time, you have to wonder about, is the person taking the money as tax money more or less ethical than the rich man?
All right. JazakAllahkhair. All right. I appreciate everyone that had something to say. So here's the thing. In the discussion, you had some people that were for, the idea of, taxing Bill Gates or taxing people in general, and you had people that were against it. Here's the thing. In the main components of a worldview, what was not stated? So if you run down these, we are in this area here, morality and ethics. Remember, I said there's certain questions you have to answer before you get to morality and ethics. So in order to justify not taxing, or let's say taxing, actually not taxing, before you justify that, to say, look, you don't have a right to tax, what is the reason why that the government does not have a reason to tax? What do you think would be the underlying reason? And I kind of mentioned it just for a second. What do you think? Bilal, what do you think? Just say it nice and loud. Slavery. Okay? But there's something that comes even before that. Who wants to give it a shot? What do you think? There's an underlying assumption, unspoken assumption, or maybe it is spoken assumption if you've studied libertarianism. Okay, the government being oppressive, but there's something that comes even before that. Yeah. The government is above the society. Okay, maybe. Willpower? No. So here's the thing. The assumption is that you own yourself. I want you to think about that for a second. So if you assume that we own ourselves, then the argument becomes very effective. The problem is, if I did a survey in this room and asked, people here, how many people believe you own yourself? I would say most of you would say no. Why? Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Indeed, to Allah we belong, and to Allah is the return. So right there, you say, hold on a second. Before we come to a conclusion about this particular moral act, there are certain things that we have to check off, right? Because someone could extend the argument into something like zakat. But wait a minute, are you saying that the government, the Islamic government, can take my zakat money and give it to the poor without my choice? But if you're under the assumption that you own yourself, then you may have an argument. But the argument against that is you don't own yourself. But that question about who owns you, that's not a question about morality and ethics. That falls somewhere else. Ontologically, your ontology, rather the anthropology, who or what is man, and who possesses man, who owns the human being, right? So what I'm trying to point out here is that when you get to moral and ethical questions, and you start to look at Islamic, let's say, answers, or things that seem immoral or unethical Islamically, questions about slavery, underage marriage, whatever it might be, these questions, these hot topics within the Islamic framework, you have to understand there are a number of ideas and presuppositions that come before the ethical question. And if you don't know those and you can't tease those out, again, you'll be running in a circle, right? On any question. You can take any example you want. I mentioned libertarianism. There's another, you can say, philosophy that has to do with utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is basically the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And there's another thought experiment that's usually done. It's the famous train experiment. Have you guys heard of this? I think Nathan's heard of it. Anyone else? Few people, right? So the experiment, just to give you an example, it's this. Imagine that you're on a train, okay, and the brakes of the train fail. Now, you can go into the driver's cockpit, whatever they call it in the train, and you try to push the brakes, they don't work, but what you can do is you can turn the train to move off the track, to go to another track, okay? But here's the problem. In front of you, if you let the train keep going, you have 5 people in front of you. If you turn the train, you've got 1 person in front of you. And either way, you cannot stop the train. You can't yell, they can't hear you, all right? What, in this situation, what is the moral thing to do? Okay, yes? No, I left that out on purpose. Just leave it as 1 person and 5 people. Yeah. Yes. Okay. It sounds weird when you say it, right? I'd kill the 1 person and let the 5 people live, but okay, I get what you're saying. How many people would let the train go? You would let the train go, just kill the 5 people. Okay, why? It's on a schedule? I mean, what do you, like you can turn it and it just. Ah, okay. So you don't want to take the responsibility. You're like, you know what? Whatever it is, you. Okay. All right. Yeah. Right. So how do you deal with this issue though? If you didn't turn the train, you'd be responsible for killing the 5 people. Yes, you're the only one on this train. Everyone's jumped off. They took your manhaj and boom, they just jumped off. I don't know. You were like, I have a responsibility. Okay. By the way, are we talking about in an Islamic worldview? Because we're saying let's transcend the Islamic, not transcend, but let's get out of the Islamic worldview for a second. We're not talking about Islam. Let's say in just a modern secular worldview, right? We don't have those things to rely upon. So what should you do? It's what? Okay. So, yeah, the greater good. All right. Yes. Right. Yeah. Okay. So, gotcha. Okay. So I understand what you're saying, right? So it's basically it's like a numbers game now, right? You can either save 5 and kill 1, or you let 5 die and you save 1, right? So in this circumstance, you're going to do what? I mean, most people, right, just kind of right off the bat would say, turn the train, right? And so therefore, you've saved 5 people, or you've saved 5 people and you've killed 1 person, right? Let me tweak the example even more into the realm that you're in. Let's say now you're standing on a bridge, okay? And on this bridge, you're looking down at this train, and it doesn't have a driver. So you're looking down at this train, and you see this train is speeding really fast towards these 5 people. And right next to you is a very tall, big person, right? Big. And you know, and you're pretty sure, I mean, you're like 99% sure, that if you just kind of like kicked him over, he would fall, the train would hit, it would be diverged, and those 5 people would be saved. Would you push him over? No? Why? Isn't it a 5-to-1? What's the difference? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Fair enough, fair enough. Okay. Here's the thing. Can I stretch it even more? I'll stretch it even more. Let's say you work in that hospital, all right? And these 5 people that got hit by this train, they all come into the hospital. And you know that each one of those 5 needs a different organ to have them survive. And some random guy walks in for a checkup. And you know you could basically take the organs from this guy and save all 5 of them. Do you do it? Right? So here's the problem, though. So this is like this sort of equation that we're setting up. It's basically, you know, what we're talking about here is the idea that you have to have the greatest good for the greatest number of people. That's where utilitarianism kind of formulates this idea. So it's basically you have, you know, what is the greatest utility for the maximum number of people? The problem with this, as you can see, is that it runs into a few problems. Namely, one of those problems is, what about the value of individual human life? Okay, especially in this example, especially the person that didn't have the choice and you kill him one way or the other, whatever it might be, okay? Now the issue is, this particular worldview, or this particular way of looking at politics, or whatever you want to call it, is used in a number of different scenarios that you might run into. For example, the harm principle. You do what you want as long as you don't harm anyone else. Okay? This is also kind of a subset of utilitarianism. Now, this runs into a number of problems as well. One of the first problems, how do you define harm? Is it limited to physical harm? What about mental harm? But when you tease it out and you keep going, you still run into problems. Okay? So for example, let's take a controversial example, the LGBT example, right? A person, as long as they consent with each other, and they can have whatever relations, you know, whatever sort of relations they want to have, right? No one is harming the other person. Okay, if we extend it, can you apply the same argument to an incestuous relationship, where you have 2 adults, and they're, let's say, brother and sister, whatever it might be. I know this is a bit explicit, but they're adults, they're consenting, they have protection, whatever it might be. There's no chance of, you know, some sort of problems. Can you use the harm principle and be consistent with it? Most people would say, wait a minute, that's a different case. The problem is you have to be inconsistent with the harm principle, okay? And so therefore, one of the reasons I'm highlighting these issues is that, number one, there's a whole list of components of a worldview that you have to deal with before you get to the ethics and morality of an issue. That's number one. Number two, anything that falls outside of the Islamic paradigm, you are by necessity going to find contradictions and cracks and problems with it, okay? Now that's just not me making a bold claim. I'm saying you can test it yourself, all right? So whether you want to take a look at liberalism, libertarianism, utilitarianism, feminism, postmodernism, modernism, you pick it. Even the concepts of like democracy, socialism, you know, even economic concepts, capitalism, and so on and so forth, once you start teasing away, you are inevitably going to find cracks in that particular worldview. And that is why I'm trying to stress on the idea that Islam, to say it's just a religion, is a faux pas, right? The word deen means a lot more than that, right? So going back to what we were speaking about yesterday, if I have it, I don't know which way I was going here, let's see. Come on. Oh, this one. So yesterday we asked the question, is Islam a religion? And we said the understanding of a religion, there's two understandings of a religion. What does religion mean as a dictionary definition, or what we say a normative understanding? And so from a normative understanding, if you open the dictionary, what does the word religion mean? You might be able to say, yes, Islam would be a religion from the normative understanding. But if you ask someone, is Islam a religion, and what do you mean by religion? You're a descriptive understanding, meaning what is the person interpreting when you're saying it? Islam isn't a religion from that perspective. Because when you say religion, there are a certain set of assumptions. A, there's no overlap with what we call the secular. Okay? So there's immediately this concept of you have religion and then you have secular. Religion is private, the secular is public. Okay? But if you try to look at Islam, the problem is that you have many things within Islam that overlap and go into the public sphere. Okay? So to say that Islam is a religion becomes problematic based on the context and based on how you're using the term. Now, I mentioned, this was a statement we mentioned yesterday, Roshan Abbasi, he said, in medieval Islamic understanding, it was religion that regulated and delimited the secular realm. In the pre-modern era, it was what we call religion that gave the boundaries and the borders of what we call the secular world. But around what some researchers call the long 19th century, right? The early 1800s all the way into 1920s or so, you had a shift where the secular gives the boundaries to what religion is. And the problem is when you try to fit Islam into this, you run into problems because you've translated in most of the text deen as religion. And this becomes very problematic. Even when we're speaking to people and they say, I don't believe in organized religion, or that's a religion, like Christianity is a religion, Hinduism a religion, and so on and so forth, it would seem to me that a better way of having someone understand Islam, even for ourselves, is not to classify it as a religion as it's used in our vernacular, but to classify it as a paradigm or a worldview that has all the components we spoke about yesterday. All right? The ontology, epistemology, anthropology. Islam includes all of this, and then you can do a fair comparison. Because otherwise, if you told someone, hey, is feminism a religion? What are you talking about, man? Right? Is libertarianism a religion? No. Right? Is philosophical naturalism a religion? For those of you who know what that is? No. Right? But Islam runs antagonist to these worldviews in one way or another. And so therefore, in order to actually deal with these things, you have to understand Islam as something to be more comprehensive. All right? Okay, so we spoke about Islam as a deen. This is an example that I wanted to give. So how many people are here from the subcontinent? I just want a quick raise of hands. All right, you got a few people. All right. There's a very amazing scholar that's not really spoken about. And this scholar, his name is Al-Biruni. Now, Al-Biruni, before you guys start reading the slide, let me get away from there for a second. So Al-Biruni, what's really phenomenal about him is that he actually studied Hinduism very deeply. And they say that he was able to acquire 20 of the dialects within the Indian subcontinent, which is a big deal, because if you're from the subcontinent, or if you're from India specifically, the country of India, going from one part of the country to another part of the country, you're actually running through a whole linguistic, like rainbow almost, right? It's very difficult to anyway. Now, the background to this, just very quickly, like how did he get to India and so on and so forth. Islam coming to India, most people, like if I ask, how did Islam get to India? Who can tell me? Any history buffs here? Nobody? Sorry? Traders? Yeah, I don't know about that. How did it first get? Yeah, I heard it. What? Muhammad bin Qasim. Okay. So yes, that's the initial kind of bringing Islam. But who kind of fortified it? Like really grounded it? Preachers, okay. But before the preachers. I'm testing everyone's history of the subcontinent. Yeah. The Ottoman Empire? No. That was later. That's later. Yes, Mahmud al-Ghaznawi is who I was talking about. So if you know, Mahmud al-Ghaznawi was in what's modern-day Afghanistan, okay? And so what he would do is, I mean, if you read some of the historical accounts of Mahmud al-Ghaznawi, it's very interesting. Like basically, there's a narration, and Allahu A'lam the veracity of the narration, but I'll mention it, that, you know, when he was born, his father made a dua, made a supplication, said, "Oh Allah, just like you made the Prophet ﷺ destroy the idols of the Kaaba, so make my son a destroyer of idols." Okay? Again, I don't know the veracity of the narration, it's mentioned in books. So Mahmud al-Ghaznawi, he's in Afghanistan, which is a Muslim territory at the time, and he goes into India, and one of his kind of military, you know, aspects of his military genius is that it wasn't just in warfare in the sense that he understood military strategy by way of how do you defeat the other side by military tactics. But he also understood the psychology, background, worldview of the people that were there. And he knew by studying that they had a very deep reliance on the idols that were standing there, right? The idols in the city. And they had a core belief that as long as the idols of the city were standing, no one can harm us. So when he would go into a city and attack the city, what do you think the first thing he did was? Destroy the idols. Because he wanted to have that cognitive dissonance within people, right? Say, wait a minute, this is what we attach to our worldview, now something's wrong, okay? So what happened was a lot of the people in those cities, some of them actually joined the Muslim forces, right? Some of them became Muslim, and so on and so forth. Now, these excursions, they were deep into the Hind or the Indian heartland. And he was known to have a military might that was quick and fast, very light. And they said he had 17 of these excursions deep into India, all right? Now, one of these excursions was a place where they housed a certain idol by the name of Somnath. Somnath was kind of like the main idol of the area. So much like Mecca was the main place in the Arabian Peninsula where everyone would come, they would worship the idols and so on, pay homage to the idols. This city that housed Somnath was very similar. People would come from all over the Indian subcontinent, worship, you know, Somnath. So when he gets to this city, the religious leaders, right, the pundits come out and they say, look, you can take the city, just don't do anything to Somnath. Just leave it alone, okay? And they start pouring at his feet incredible amounts of money, right? Gold and jewelry and diamonds, incredible amounts of money. So now, he's looking at all of this and he rejects it. He says, I'm not here for the money, basically, right? He goes in one of the narrations, he looks up and this idol looks like it's floating. And it's very strange. So upon investigation, some of his men, when they climb up, they find that it's actually being hung by certain types of string, certain types of strong types of string, right? Some sort of thread of some sort. And what does he tell his men? Cut the thread. When they cut the thread, when they cut these strong, you know, cables or whatever it was that holding it that was not visible, the idol comes crashing down. When it comes crashing down, inside the idol is wealth, gold, jewelry, diamonds, way more than the pundits were giving him, all right? And by some accounts, it's narrated that the very famous Koh-i-Noor diamond, you know, the biggest diamond in the world, the one that the British are borrowing from India, right now, on loan in the British Museum, they say that was part of that treasure, right? And from what I heard, they actually took pieces of Somnath and they made shoe racks in one of the masajid in Afghanistan. But anyway, so the reason I'm bringing that up is because Al-Biruni was the scholar that accompanied him. And so it wasn't just, let's just go and conquer areas and things like that, but what we're trying to do now is to bring people to understand that there's a higher purpose, there's a certain teleology, there's a certain ethic that is grounded, right? And so on. So Al-Biruni is interested in Hinduism, and in fact, it wasn't called Hinduism at the time. It's a term that the British come up with much later. So he studies the what you can call the Hindu religion based on our own vernacular. We're calling it a religion. But the reason I wanted to bring up Biruni and the fact that he was incredible, he studied with certain, you can say, spiritual leaders of India at the time, is a statement that he has. And this is the statement. And what I want you to do is look at it from a worldview perspective, a paradigm perspective, right? He says, just as the declaration of the article of faith is the emblem of the Muslim belief, yani he's talking about La ilaha illallah, right? That is the sign, that is how you understand that someone's a Muslim. He says, and Trinitarianism is a sign of Christianity, and the institution of the Sabbath is the, in other words, a sign of Judaism, so is the metempsychosis, the banner of the Indian religion. Does anyone know what that means? Right, reincarnation, rebirth, right? So that too is the banner of the Indian religion, such that he who does not profess it does not belong to it and is not considered to be a member. Why do I have this statement up there? Because what lenses is he wearing to analyze their worldview? No, he's wearing Islamic lenses. Why? Because he is trying to attach, okay, you have the Shahada, this is what defines a Muslim, right? So from an Islamic worldview, how does someone become Muslim? How is someone a Muslim? By way of the Shahada, very simple. So how do you now attach something that you can relate to based on your worldview? You look at Christianity. Okay, for them, what is the central core? What is the central pillar? Trinitarianism. For Judaism, the Sabbath. So he's trying to find something that's core and central to their worldview. But it's based on his lenses. How is he looking at, because he could have said, okay, well, they have certain religious practices, and he could have expounded upon that. He didn't, right? My only point in mentioning this is that he's taking, as opposed to what we understand as a religion, he's taking a paradigm perspective, a worldview perspective. Does that make sense? Everyone understand why I mentioned that? Okay. All right, so we were talking about even linguistically, the term deen, if you just automatically apply it to mean religion, it can be very problematic. An example of that, in the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, I'm not going to get into it because obviously we don't have the time, but at the end of the story, Yusuf alayhi salam is part of the government, right? He's what you can say, I guess, the finance minister, for lack of a better term. And, he's in the scenario where his brothers come, and so at the end of the story it says, so he began the search of their bags before the bag of his brother, right? This is the bag of his brother. He then extracted from the bag of his brother. Here he's talking about, just to give you a refresher on the story, he had placed an item in the bag, like a cup, right? So he places a cup in the bag of his brother, and it's basically to set them up, right? To basically say like, okay, so I've caught you with the cup, and I can't let you go, whatever the point is, right? So he has this cup, and so this is thus to be planned for Yusuf. He could not have taken his brother within and here it says, fi din al-malik. He could not have taken, in other words, he couldn't have put told them that I'm going to keep my brother outside of the deen of the king, which here is translated as religion. But it makes no sense. Like, what does that mean? Like, unless he accepts the deen of the king, was the king Muslim? By most accounts, no, right? So here, deen isn't referring to what we consider religion, but it's referring to the law. And the term deen itself has to do with, for instance, linguistically, it's tied to the term debt. And debt, when you compare it, you understand that there is a giving and a taking, a badal, that there's an expectation. How is a debt different than charity? A debt is that which you give with an expectation for return, whether you get it back or not. Charity is something you give with no expectation, right? So when there's this dynamic of an expectation of something in return, that term that's used has to do with debt, deen, dain. That's why Allah is called Maliki Yawmiddin, the day the debts come due. In order for you to have that sort of obligation for a debt or you have to have a standard. And that standard in this case is the standard that the king sets into place. These are the rules. If you do these, you will be, rewarded. And if you don't do these, you will be punished. And from a broader perspective, Islam falls into that concept of a deen as well. You have certain standards, certain things that again, this goes back to epistemology, that you know that if you do them, you're rewarded, and if you don't, you'll be punished, right? So anyway, the point is to simply use the word deen and apply it and say it means religion across the board is problematic, right? Even when you go through the Quran, it's got problems. All right, so therefore, and so when Allah says that whoever desires other than Islam there it says religion, but we'll say like worldview, it will never be accepted from them. a deen other than Islam will have inconsistencies and cracks. And that's why I mentioned utilitarianism, liberalism. You can take any other ism that you want to take and apply what we mentioned up here. Okay. All right. This ayah, هُوَ الَّذِي أَرْسَلَ رَسُولَهُ بِالْهُدَى وَدِينِ الْحَقِّ. He is the one who sent his messenger with guidance and the religion, the deen of truth, to manifest it over all other religion. Again, the term religion, it's problematic. Because what you're saying is that Islam is only manifest over something that we deem as religion. Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, and things that, but it's not. It's a worldview. That's why you understand the concept of truth overcoming falsehood. And the idea that truth is superior to falsehood is part and parcel of every single human being. And so a worldview that dominates is one that's rooted in truth. And so the concept of domination here, some people look at it as something really negative. Are you saying religion, like Islam is a religion, and it's so this thing that it doesn't accommodate for other religions? No, we're not saying that at all. Because a part of the worldview of Islam is to understand and give people the choice. But what we are saying is that from a worldview perspective, it completely overtakes any other worldview, right? That's why it says, لِيُظْهِرَهُ عَلَى دِينِ كُلِّ. Like يُظْهِرَهُ, dhahar means back, right? The back of something, like the back of an animal. And so therefore, when you ride an animal, you've subjugated the animal, number one. So you've subjugated the animal because you have a certain power dynamic by which you can subjugate it, number one. Number two, typically when you ride an animal, you are above everyone else. So you have this idea of superiority, not from an arrogant point of view, but from a point of view of understanding that you have a true worldview and you have a false worldview. And if you test any single worldview, you will inevitably find cracks and fissures within it. Make sense? Okay. So more truer is a bit problematic, right? So meaning it's true, of course, but even the truth in there, remember we had a whole discussion yesterday about the fitrah, right? And I'm going to get to that in a second, right? If we understand every human being is born with the fitrah, as we mentioned yesterday, we understand that even that truth that's there, it's placed there by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So there will be some overlap. But to make an absolute claim by way of only the human project, that's where the problems arise. That's why we mentioned things like utilitarianism, liberalism, and so on. Does that make sense? So yes, you're right in a certain perspective, but overall, if you test whatever it is that you're testing, you'll find that eventually, because they don't have the entirety of truth, it becomes problematic, right? Yes? Yes, exactly. Did I lose something here? Because who's my tech guy? It's all right. Okay, while he's doing that, I'll just continue. So, all right. Okay. Now that was basically just covering the foundations, the principles. So we spent all of yesterday, we spent a good chunk of today. Now, by the way, the course was not just about belief, right, or like foundational principles or philosophy. The course, in fact, is about how do you deal with doubts. So we've gone kind of like really far, but the reason why we wanted to do that is because if we don't understand these foundations, then, like I mentioned yesterday, it would be a class just about answering people's questions. And you cannot answer people's questions ad infinitum unless you understand where those questions are coming from, right? So if someone has a question about Islam and they have a problem with a certain issue within something, there's certain underlying factors that have to be dealt with before you get to the question itself. And that's why we spent so much time here. Maybe, let's see. Try again. Is that good? All right. It's probably the Mac, right? All right. All right. By the way, I was when I was doing this class in Delaware, we were talking about the fitra and things like that, and that morning, I saw this article. It's by Tom Woodward in The Spectator. It said, if you're serious about reducing your climate footprint, there's nothing more powerful you can do than decide not to have kids. So I was like, what? But here's the thing. If you recall our discussion on the fitra, you remember that we said it is a normative, or the original normative disposition, right? It is how the human being was created in a normal state, to summarize for those who weren't here yesterday, okay? What you consider normal, right? Normative. Now the problem is that you have a certain conceptualization of what's normal from your fitrah. But if you do not have something to check that fitrah, or your interpretation of it, you can run into some trouble, all right? That's why I wanted to bring up another hadith. The Prophet ﷺ, he mentions a certain parable, right? So Allah gave the parable of a straight path as having walls on either side with several open doors over which the curtains hang down. So let's make a diagram of this, just to elucidate the hadith itself. So there's a parable about the Sirat al-Mustaqim. So there's a straight path, okay? So you can say this is it. So this is kind of the end of the path. This is the beginning of the path. The person is going to enter from here, all right? And the path has two walls, all right? So these are the two walls. And each one of these walls has open doors. Okay, so this is just representing the openings and the doors. Okay? Those open doors have curtains on it. All right, I'm just paraphrasing the hadith just to get through it a bit, you know. So the Prophet ﷺ mentions that on this path, there is a collar that's inviting from the path, like from here. Okay? Then there's a collar on top. So if you look at it from top down, there's a collar on top. When a person starts to go to, and these are the limits of Allah. These are muharram Allah, like the limits that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala set, right? So every time a person starts to go towards one of these doors, right, to fall in and to fall into destruction, there's a collar on top that says, woe to you. You know, keep going on the path. So you can say, like, if the person's in this direction, they start falling, they start kind of moving away from that open door, okay? And so let's say the person keeps going to this one, another caller says, wait, woe to you, come back, and then so on and so forth. So what's really interesting is that Dr. Asrar Ahmad gives a very interesting interpretation of this hadith, and that's what I wanted to mention. He says, the collar on top, that's in the heart of every Muslim, right, is that fitrah, right? What in English they call, like, when you say things like, oh, my conscience wouldn't allow it, right? You have this deeper intuitive idea of, okay, I should do this or I shouldn't do that, right? That is the collar. Now the thing is that if you just follow the collar without any sort of way to confirm that call, you might just go straight into the door. But the collar then calls you back. Now the issue is that the straight path is like the middle, right? وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا. Indeed, we've given you a middle path. So what happens is, someone may come upon this path and they are called in one direction, right? So if you want to make it like, you want to put a political spin on it, you have, you know, I don't know, the left and the right, right? Conservatives and liberals, if you really want to, right? So you could basically look at this and say, all right, so the person is now being called, they get called on in one direction, let's say something that's conservative and right, but then something happens where their conscience kind of pulls them in the other direction. But then notice that they overshoot towards the other door, and they keep on overshooting. Now the problem is, if someone wants to take the path and go all the way to the end without overshooting, they need something else. The Prophet ﷺ mentions, what is that something else? Revelation, the Quran. How do you know that this conscience inside of you, that it's correct, take you in the right direction? I'll give you an example. This is a thought experiment. And I may have mentioned this before. There was a question that came up about a certain policy that there was a German non-profit that they had implemented. This German non-profit, they were responsible for feeding people, and they made a policy to say, we are going to prefer German citizens over everyone else. Okay, so now the question is, is this an ethical policy based on what you know about Germany? Right? What do you think? Do you think that's a fair policy for this German nonprofit? Again, it's a nonprofit, so it's private. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so in this case, it's German citizens. So what you're saying is if it's German citizens, and if they want to give it to Germans, they should have the right to do that. How many people agree with that? And by the way, let me give you some context. So Germany had a certain influx of Syrian refugees. And so the question was really about like, okay, so we have German citizens that paid and contributed towards this nonprofit, and now a lot of these funds are going towards these Syrian refugees, right? So this is where the issue actually came up, and it became like an ethical issue or a moral issue. All right, how many people, what's your name, by the way? What is it? Saud. All right, Saud. How many people agree with Saud? Like basically, okay, what, Nathan, what does this mean? Yeah, I'll agree. Okay, so you should prefer German citizens. How many people think you should not prefer German citizens? Okay. Yeah, they're both needy. Yeah, they're both needy. Okay, so you're saying no? You agree with him. They should prefer German citizens. Okay, how many people think they shouldn't prefer German citizens? They should not. Like okay, Syrians, Germans, black, white, whatever it is, just. What's ethically? What's the ethic? They would ethically not be wrong. Okay, that's the question. All right. Sisters, what's your opinion on this? Ethically no, but more. It's like ethically no, but ethically right. Okay. Okay. Right. Yeah. So on a purely moral basis, you say it's wrong. Wait. Well, that's a separate question. But what we're saying now is that is it ethically wrong or morally wrong for them to prefer German citizens? That's the simple question. So I'll let you know. Don't bring Islam into this right now, dude. This is all like non-Muslims, so this is a completely different dynamic. we gotta, the thing is, I present these questions to Muslims. MashaAllah, that's the first place they go to, right? Which is good, because it means your worldview is bam. Like you're looking at the world through Islam, which is excellent. That always makes me really happy, by the way. But then I have to pull people back about, okay, we have to look at it from like almost like a modern, secular, materialist, whatever you want to call it, worldview. All right, so going back to the issue, we had some people that agreed with it, some people didn't. Who said like, yes, doesn't matter who it is, we should not prefer German citizens? Let me see some hands. We should not prefer German citizens and just give the funds to whoever needs it. Okay, so how do you justify it? How do you justify it being morally wrong to only prefer German citizens? Okay. Okay. I didn't say Jewish. Yeah. That would be really hard pill to swallow. It's like no Jews. It's like oh man. Okay, so you're saying it's a type of racism. You're saying it's a type of... Okay. 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 All right, so who has a response to... I forgot what your name is. Tariq. Who has a response to Tariq? Wait, hold on a second. Any sisters? Anyone want to respond to him? Or everyone agrees on the sister side, I think, right? Like, yeah, you shouldn't prefer German citizens. Okay. From the brothers who said that you should prefer German citizens, who wants to respond to Tariq? Yeah, Bilal. A bit loud. All right. So maybe in a sense you're saying that because they're part of the secular world and they value freedom, is that, okay. Do you want to respond to him or you want to? Okay. But here we're speaking just about Germany. So we're not saying, yani, it's the same thing. Ah, I see. So you're saying, okay, fair enough. So you're saying it's based upon that. So as long as another organization can only support Syrians, that's an interesting one. Okay, so then you can go against the claim of racism. So he's got a solution for you. So you prefer German citizens, but then you start another organization. All right. Who else wants to? Yeah, Nathan.
So it's German citizens, not necessarily the German ethnicity.
No, it's just German citizens.
Then that's totally fair.
All right.
Country is technically only obligated to take care of itself.
Okay. That's it. So is how many sisters agree with that? A country's only technically obligated to take care of its own. Morally, even morally. Like, because look, it's a question of, like, what we're asking about is the moral question here, right? So your obligation is to your own. Oh! Oh, man. So here's the thing. So I'm going to tell you a little story. My son, right, one of my sons, he's an anomaly. Like, he is this conservative that came out of I don't know where, okay? Like, his opinions are always like, bam, far right. And I'm just like, dude, where did you come from, right? You know, come back to the center, right? So this is the argument that he used. He said, no, the Germans should be able to prefer. I said, why? He said, Baba, if I was going hungry and, 5 neighborhoods down, there was a child going hungry, who would you prefer? I said, well, obviously it'd be you. He says, well, why? I said, because you're my family. He goes, so why can't you use that same line of reasoning with German citizens? Which is a powerful argument. All right. How about a counter-argument? They're selfish? Selfish to support your own family? No, but if you have food for your family, like either he dies or the guy down the street dies. Do you have kids? Okay, just checking. But yeah, there's always going to be finite resources. We're not infinite resources wouldn't be a problem, right? That you could feed everyone. So here's the thing. Yeah, you want to respond? See, I think so here's the thing. It would be well, I don't want to give an opinion on it, but okay, you have a Syrian family that's way worse than all the German families. Do you still prefer German families? That's what she's saying.
That's the issue. They're not even considering that. They're just saying, you're German nationality, here you go. We're going to pay for you.
Okay. So can I just mention a response that was given that was trying to deal with that family response? Here's the response, which just blew my mind, because this question was asked to a bunch of college students coming from Harvard and Yale and stuff like that. It was actually it was an ethical question that was asked to them. So someone came up with this family thing. They said, what about family? Like, we prefer our family, therefore we should prefer German citizens. What blew my mind was the response. The response was, even the family structure is unjust. It has a power hierarchy. And therefore families, no, just listen, and this person was serious. Families should be done away with. Okay, why am I mentioning that? Coming back to the diagram, right? Your fitra always wants justice, okay? So there's a concept of families, that's a powerful argument, right? So your fitra is taking you towards that. But then you say, wait a minute, that would be unjust for whatever, German, like to prefer German citizens. Your fitra takes you in the opposite direction. But then you start going to extremes. Unless you have something to lock you down. Yes, families have value. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given it value. The very human has value because Allah has given it value. In a materialistic framework, even the human being doesn't have value. In the sense that where does the value come from? How is it tied? What gives the human being value? What gives the family structure value? Right? So you have a justification that's ontologically, that's sound. You have a moral anchor to give that justification. But if you don't have that moral anchor, you can be zigzagging right to left, right to left, and you can come to some really interesting conclusions, like the one that I mentioned in the article where the guy said, look, we understand the environment is an issue. Muslims say, yes, the environment's an issue. But no Muslim's going to come now and say, okay, stop having kids, right? But again, where are you saying that this person, they don't have a good intention? No, he does. This person has the intention, we want to save the environment. You can't negate the intention. The problem is, what kind of borders do you give that intention, right? Okay, so coming back to the actual topic of the class, All right, so we were talking about dealing with your own doubts or the doubts of others, right? So let's move on. So we covered the metaphysical backdrop. We spent some time on it. We even spent some time on it today. Let's move on. We'll move on to what we call the nature of the heart. All right, so just very quickly, and I'm sure many of you may know this, may not know this, the heart in the Islamic worldview, it is actually at the core, at the center, right? And I don't mean physically at the center. What I mean is, even when we talk about things like how do you attain certainty, right? So if we're talking about doubts, I'm doubting Islam. I'm doubting because this hadith doesn't make sense. This ayah in the Quran doesn't make sense. There is, as we mentioned yesterday, we have cognitive limits, just like we have ocular limits. I cannot see what's going on 2 neighborhoods down. We have auditory limits. I cannot hear what's going on in the neighbor's house 5 neighborhoods down. Similarly, we have cognitive limits, right? Now, we're not saying you do not use your intellect. That's not what I'm saying. Obviously, the Quran is very robust in its move towards using your intellect. But we understand that there are cognitive, rational limits. And we spoke about this yesterday when we spoke about the fitrah. So from the Islamic worldview, we understand that there is the idea that certainty is not just a rational concept, but it is a rational and spiritual concept which are tied with the concept of the heart itself. All right? So what do we mean by the heart? In Arabic, it's called a qalb, qalaba, taqallub. It comes from the root, which means to turn around or turn something upside down. So for those of you who know, like for instance, a revolution that turns the government upside down or the structure upside down is called inqilab, right? Qallaba, coming from the same root. I think it's the same in Urdu as well, if I'm not mistaken. So what is the desired state of the heart? It's to have a sound heart, a qalb that is salim. And this is when we're talking about worldviews, cognitive limitation, all these things, that's fine. But what a person needs in order for that worldview to be grounded is to have a heart that is in the state of being salim, qalbun salim, right? That's what the ayah is speaking about. And similarly, the Prophet ﷺ mentions, truly in the body there is a morsel of flesh. If it is sound, the whole body is sound, and when it's corrupted, the whole body is corrupted. Truly, it is the heart. So the center, when it comes to understanding the world around us, our worldview, and all these things, is tied to the heart. There's an element of the intellect, but the intellect isn't the end all. Okay, and that's very important to understand. If a person is suffering through doubts, if they're going through these destructive doubts, you have to understand there is an element that has to do with the intellect, no doubt, but that's not the end all. Okay? All right, let's take a look at the heart's main fitan. There's 2 types of illnesses when it comes to heart. What we call shahawat, which are just desires, and shubuhat. What we're talking about today is shubuhat. Those doubts that can creep into your mind, creep into your heart, they attack your heart and they start to destroy the foundations of your iman, right? But you can also have what's known as shahawat, desires. Someone may have a certain desire to eat something or drink something or do something, whatever it might be, and those can also affect the heart itself, right? And you could think about, I don't know, every human being has desires, right? The problem is when those desires go too far, this is when the attack starts on the heart, right? And especially if the person doesn't repent, then they start to fester within the heart. Now those are shahwat, desires. Ibn al-Qayyim mentions fitnas of 2 types, the fitna of shubuhat, this one being the greater of the 2 and the fitna of the shahwat. Those doubts, those destructive doubts a person has by way of some sort of qawl, someone saying something, or you're hearing something, or you're thinking about something. Ibn al-Qayyim is saying that they're at a higher level than you just wanting to do something, right? So if you like alcohol, you like drinking, okay, that's a shahwa. That can also be kind of, it's one of the heart's main fitan. It's one of the heart's main trials. But it's not as dangerous as shubuhat. Why? Because shubuhat are dealing with things that have to do with your worldview. And that's what is more dangerous. However, there's a caveat here. Shahwat can sometimes lead to shubuhat. And how does this happen? This happens, and I think many of us have experienced it. You're engaged in something that you like doing, okay? And then you're saying, it's really bad, I should repent unto Allah. Eventually what happens, though, is you want to find some sort of justification. Your conscience doesn't allow you to just hang with it and keep on sinning. So what do you do then? What you do is you say, oh, let me ask Sheikh so-and-so, see if I get a difference of opinion, and so they don't make it halal, and then I can keep doing it, right? Okay? This is part of the, but when it comes to that level, you've entered into the realm of shubuhat now, right? Because now they're more destructive to the fundamentals, the worldview perspective. So even with shahwat, if they keep on going and there's no repentance involved, there's no turning back to Allah, they can fester so much so that they become shubuhat, become doubts. Everyone clear on this point? Okay. All right, so what does shubuhat, what does it refer to? It's the plural of the term shubha. A shubha is called so because it resembles tushbihu, the truth. Okay, let me get into a little bit of etymology here. The word shubha or shubuhat comes from the triliteral sheen, ba, ha in the Arabic language. Okay? What this triliteral root refers to is when things are similar. And I'll give you an example. When in Surah Al-Baqarah, when Musa alayhi salam goes to Bani Israel, and he says to Bani Israel, Inna Allaha ya'murukum an tadhbahu baqara. Indeed, Allah has ordered you to slaughter a cow. What was the response by Bani Israel? Did they say, oh, sami'na wa ta'na, okay, we hear, we obey, boom, we're going to slaughter it? Was that their response? No. Their response was what? Okay, what kind of cow, what color cow, what kind, all these, they're just kind of stretching the issue. At a certain point, they say to Musa alayhi salam, they say, Innal baqara tashabaha alayna. All of these cows, tashabaha, it's the same root. They all look the same. They are similar. We can't tell this cow from this cow. Okay? So we find that this term has to do with two things that are being similar or very similar, such that there's something that's not clear. Similarly, you have in the Quran, Allah mentions those ayat that are muhkam in the beginning of Surah Al-Imran. Those ayat that are muhkam and those ayat that are mutashabih. Those ayat mutashabih that are so clear, this unclear because it could mean this or it could mean that. And it's only when you know the muhkam you can decide. The muhkam are those that are explicit. Muhkam being things like if you go to like a gas station and the sign says open, you don't go to your friend and say, I wonder what that means, right? Muhkam, it's clear, like there's no, but mutashabih are those that are, it could mean this or it could mean that, right? This similar. How do you tell the difference or how do you get the right interpretation? By looking at the muhkam. Point being, this term, the triliteral root, sheen, baha, shubaha, shubuhat come from that which resembles the truth, but they are not the truth. And this becomes very important, okay? Because shubuhat will attack the heart, but the only way into the heart is to have some element of the truth. Shaitan cannot come to you with pure falsehood, right? He has to come sprinkle it with something true in order to attack the heart, right? And that's why they're called shubuhat, and that's why Al-Fayyumi says a shubha is called so because it resembles tushbihu, the truth. Ibn Taymiyyah mentions every significant belief usually contains an element of truth, right? Shubha min al-haq, since if it wasn't the case, such views would not have circulated. Every human, like we said yesterday, is born upon the fitrah. Everyone recognizes truth to be at a higher, more virtuous level than falsehood. Every human being. I'm not talking about Muslims only. Muslims, non-Muslims, whatever it might be, because that is part and parcel of the human project. So we have certain concepts about truth, that we prefer truth to falsehood. We have certain concepts about what we consider good, right? Because good in meta language is a secondary word. You can't say, oh, this is good. Okay, why is it good? Well, good is good because it's good. Okay, well, you can't get any further than that, right? Similarly, beauty. You're not going to ask, is beauty beautiful? Right? Is truth true? So what we're saying is that part of the fitrah has to do with the recognition that truth is something to be struggled for. Therefore, the truth has to be part and parcel of a doubt that comes in. There has to be something true, but it resembles the truth. It is not the truth. The issue is not the shubha. You're going onto a website, you see some ex-Muslim, he's talking about all of these issues, and you're like, wait, I need to go and respond. No, you don't. Right? Just because it resembles the truth, the effect that may have on the person is not because of the weight of the argument or the weight of the statement the person's making. It has more to do with yourself and the state of your heart. Shubuhat are not strong. Our hearts are the ones that are weak. And this is a very important distinction to understand. Okay, moving on. Let's look at some of today's crises and challenges. So one of the big ones, atheism. There's a whole course we do on this called the divine reality. So if you're interested, we might be able to do it at some time, okay? Skepticism. We talked about this yesterday. Liberalism. We mentioned some of that here. Extremism, postmodernism, nihilism, feminism, and so on and so forth. Is anyone kind of triggered the fact that I have feminism up there? No? Good. I'm going to keep moving then. No. Any wave. You'd pick first, second, or third. I'll let you have any wave you want. Because one of the issues with feminism is that people equate it with women's rights. But feminism, keep in mind, it's a worldview, it's a paradigm. It's not that Islam doesn't believe in women's rights. But again, our paradigm and worldview establishes rights for women because it has a ontological anchor to do so. With feminism, from any point of view you look at, there is no ontological. And when you get into first and second and third wave, the problems has to get worse and worse, right? So it's important to understand feminism does not equal women's rights. Islam believes in women's rights, believes in men's rights, believe it or not. So if you're in the red pill movement, get out of that movement, right? If you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry about it, okay? It believes in men's rights. It believes in animal rights. And most importantly, it believes in the rights of Allah, which is completely missing from the discourse, right? Outside of the Islamic framework. All right. So nihilism or nihilism, anyone know what nihilism is? Just curious. All right, what is it? No purpose. It's all just dark and bleak and, you know, it's free for all and suicide seems great. Because remember, so when you know people say like, oh, you should be good. Okay, why should you be good? It has to have some sort of anchoring, right? I mean, for the Muslim, you say, okay, you should be good because when you die, you're going to meet Allah. There's a meaning to it, right? But nihilism comes from the concept of it all being meaningless. If you don't believe in a hereafter, you don't have any sort of root in the hereafter. Your eschaton, right? You don't have anything established. Then what is this life? Whether you're here for 80 years or 5 minutes, you have to leave the room. So what's the purpose of it all? It's all just meaningless. That's what we mean by nihilism. And there's a very good paper that one of our guys did, Yusuf ponders. So if you go to the Sapience Institute website, he has a whole paper and actually a whole course on nihilism. They're very powerful. All right, and also, by the way, on atheism, we had the divine reality will be up soon as well. So the whole course will be online, inshallah. Okay, so these are the things, sources of doubt. So there's a really good paper that was written by Yaqeen Institute where they did a quantitative analysis, and they had a sample set of a certain number of people, and they started asking them, what are the things that causes doubts? Why do you doubt Islam? And so they broke it up into three main areas. There were moral and social concerns, philosophical and scientific concerns, and then personal trauma. Under moral and social concerns, these are some of the things that were listed. The teachings about the role of women. So notice, and one of the things you want to look at is, are these paradigmatic issues, in other words, issues of worldviews, or is there something else that's the problem here? So, teachings about the role of women. The hypocrisy of religious people, that is non-religious behavior of supposedly religious individuals. I'm sure people have experienced this. I've experienced this, believe it or not, right? The bad things that people do in the name of religion. The intolerance that some religious people show towards other faiths. The way that religious people sometimes insist that there's only one right way to practice faith. And the intolerance that some religious people show towards certain other people. For example, homosexuals, right? So all of those were listed, and then some, and you can check out the study, by the way, I'd really recommend it, it's good. What causes Muslims to doubt, a quantitative analysis. So this was under moral and social concerns. Philosophical and scientific concerns, this was the second section, main area. This was the debate over evolution versus creation. This was a big one. Uncertainty over the existence of God, the problem of evil and unfair suffering in the world, feeling that certain religious beliefs or practices do not make sense. So this comes to the point about how do these things make sense, but again, from a worldview paradigmatic perspective, a lot of these are solved from that perspective, right? So this is why we always tell people, don't jump into answering a person's question and trying to justify things for them. You have to understand what background they're coming from. All right, this one, personal trauma, finding that being religious does not make one happy, not feeling welcomed in your faith community, the death of a loved one. Has anyone experienced this, finding that religious does not make one happy? You don't have to raise your hand. Don't raise your hand. I shouldn't have asked that. But in other words, I think a lot of people experience this. In fact, the khutbah that I did for Eid, after Ramadan, the whole khutbah was on this. Basically what I said was, I was like, look man, you know, one of the things that happens in Ramadan is you meet all these people that tell you how wonderful Ramadan was and how their iman was through the roof. I was like, what if you're one of those people who had a really hard Ramadan, your iman was not through the roof, and you really don't like fasting? Like, what happens to you? And so the point was that, look, in this particular month, you will have people that have an elevated iman, and that's good, alhamdulillah. But the point of Ramadan isn't to worship the feeling, it's to worship Allah. So it's not about whether you got the feeling or not, and you should be disappointed that you didn't get the feeling. But understand, again, from a paradigmatic worldview perspective, that it's not about the feeling. It's about the one you worship, right? So anyway, so this can be, you know, problematic, finding that being religious does not make one happy. Because from a worldview perspective, then happiness is the goal. As opposed to when we were talking about teleology, about the afterlife being the goal, or something else, right? The pleasure of Allah and so on and so forth. The death of a loved one. Okay. All right. Any questions up to this point? Because now I have to speed through the 10 strategies, basically. Any questions? Everyone's brains fried with overload of information? All right, so let's start in earnest. And I'll try to get through these quickly, and that way you guys can go and, I think there's food here, by the way. Don't quote me. There is? Okay, all right. Oh yeah, what do we have tonight, if you don't mind me asking? Oof, barbecue. All right, you want to stick around? So I can keep you guys to 11 then, because barbecue, you don't get, no, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. All right, let's start off. So the 10 strategies to deal with your or other people's doubts, your shubuhat. Remember we talked about what a shubha is. Strategy number, so the first thing to understand is in these strategies, some of these strategies you'll apply before, some you'll apply after, and some you'll apply before and after, okay? So to run through them quickly, the first strategy is to be aware that the shubha or the shubuhat exist. There are callers and things like that that you can, you know, that they're actually out there and they're dangerous. Second would be to not to pay any attention to them. We'll get into some details about that. To make the distinction. Is it wrong to ask questions about Islam? Well, no. The Sahaba asked questions. But what is the difference between a valid question and a shubha? So we'll talk about making the distinction. How do you know what the difference is, or how do you recognize that? We'll talk about your environment. Studying Islam. How does studying Islam help clarify shubuhat? Right? And how is studying Islam different than just studying? We'll talk a little bit about critical thinking, finding a specialist, dealing with trauma, and the last two sections will be focus on your heart and to make dua. Now I'm gonna mention this. If we stop at 10, I have half an hour. I don't think I'll be able to cover all 10, right? I will try my utmost best. So I'm gonna try to get through as many as I can, as quickly as I can. But just to give you some, you know, something to do, or something, you know, that I don't want to just leave you here and say, well, what about the other 5? This course in its entirety was professionally recorded. So I got an opportunity to go out to Turkey, go there, enjoy some Turkish cuisine, and basically get hammered into, like, you know, days and days and days of just recording. That course will be up online and available for free for anyone that wants to take it. But the condition here is that you will take it as a course, not as a YouTube video. So therefore, in order to take this course, you actually have to register, take the course, take the exams, and actually pass it. So it is a course. It is not just, you know, 25 YouTube videos that, inshallah, you'll watch one day, okay? So even if I don't get through everything, you know, we'll let you guys know when the course is up and ready, bi'idhnillah. Is that fair? Okay, alhamdulillah. All right, so let's start with the first strategy. Number 1, be aware. So this comes before the shubha comes and attacks your heart. All right? So understand, knowing that something presents a danger and that exists allows you to not be a victim of its evil. Understanding that shubuhat exist. And these shubuhat have had effects on people. Like, they're out there. There are doubts that people will try to feed you. You have doubts that you'll go to certain websites. There are doubts that there's out there. So the first thing to understand is that they are dangerous and they can affect you. You are not Superman. You are not going to be able to just, because I'm so amazing and I'm so intellectually powerful and I'm so erudite, so educated that I can deal with any shubha. We mentioned earlier that shubuhat and their effects are not only solved by way of rationality. So So even if you're the smartest person in the world, you could still be affected by shubuhat. Therefore, first thing to understand is to be aware that they are out there and they exist, all right? The Sahaba were worried about nifaq, which is an indication that they were worried about themselves and they were the best, right? And Ibrahim alayhi salam, for instance, supplicated to Allah not to worship idols. And this is Khalilullah, this is the friend of Allah. And he is making dua to Allah, right, that to not worship idols. The Prophet ﷺ is asking to keep his heart firm upon Islam. Ya muqallib al-qulub, thabbit qalbi ala dinik. O turner of hearts, keep my heart firm upon your deen, right? So the point is, do not take shubuhat lightly, okay? So it's like, if you were to take an example, if you see an ocean full of sharks, are you just going to jump in? Be like, yo, I got this. No. Unless you understand how sharks work and you have the proper protective clothing and whatever it might be, and you're a researcher who studied sharks, yeah, then maybe you can jump in. But just as a random person, be like, I got this, man. I can figure all of this out, and jump in, you wouldn't do it. So the point is, shubuhat are very, very, very dangerous. And if the danger, what you lose at the end is your iman, which should be ringing alarm bells, right, for you. And therefore, number one, the first step, which comes before the shubha, is to be aware that they actually are out there and they exist. And more so in this day and age, by the way, especially with the internet and the proliferation of all sorts of ideas and concepts and things like that, you are going to be exposed to them, so you have to be aware they exist. Number two, we know they exist. Don't give them any attention. And some of the feedback I got was like, that seems like a cop-out. Like as if Islam does not have answers. We can't deal with these shubuhat. No, that's not the point. First of all, if you remember what I said about shubuhat, it's not that the shubuhat have value. It's that our hearts are weak. So you have to understand that as a point, right? Shubuhat are not strong. They don't have value. They don't have strength in their arguments. The point is, when we say don't pay attention, we're not saying that Islam doesn't have answers. But you have to give it time, and you can be qualified to do that. You can spend time studying it, but you have to worry about your heart first and foremost before you start worrying about the answer itself. So the protection comes from you and your iman, which is first and foremost. So don't pay any attention to them. All right? Before the shubha, before it enters, do not engage with media or platforms that give rise to shubuhat. You have all sorts of YouTube channels from ex-Muslims that is their call. They're calling people to this batil. And if you just happen to stumble on there and say, oh, this is interesting, I could deal with this. Maybe not. Maybe there'll be a certain thing that they'll throw your way and you're like, wait a minute, because for a number of reasons, maybe a certain lack of knowledge within the Islamic framework. Wait a minute, are you saying that X, Y, and Z happened in the Sira? Uh-oh, now these are doubts that now what do I do, right? So don't engage with media or platforms that give rise to shubuhat. This does not mean they are valid or have an intellectual basis. Again, shubuhat are not strong. We just have weak hearts, all right? Shubuhat are like parasites that suck your iman. Even the prophetic advice was to run away from them. When the Prophet ﷺ spoke about Al-Masih Dajjal, what did the Prophet ﷺ say? When you see him, go and confront him. Like I had a friend of mine, the hadith where the boy comes and he meets the Masih Dajjal and then he chops him in half, right? And then when he brings it back together, he goes, now do you believe? He said, now I know you're Masih Dajjal. My friend was like, I want to be that kid. I'm like, no, son, you do not want to be that kid, right? You don't know, because we have du'as that the Prophet ﷺ taught us to seek protection from Masih Dajjal, right? You may think you're very strong. You don't know that. And so prophetic advice, the Prophet ﷺ is telling us, when you're in those situations, there's nothing wrong with just taking a step back and just moving away. Because what you have on the line is way more valuable than whatever sort of ego trip you're on to think you can take it on. All right. Whoever hears news of Al-Masih Dajjal, let him flee from him. By Allah, a man will go to him considering himself a believer, but instead will follow him because of the doubts he will present. Okay? All right. Whoever falls prey to the claws of their doubts, this is from Ibn al-Qayyim, will have his faith shredded to pieces. Whoever allows his heart to open to their vile tribulations will find himself a burning furnace, and whoever lends an ear to their deceptions will find them coming between him and firm belief. Indeed, the corruption they cause on earth is great, but most people are unaware. Okay, so if it enters, let's say, we're talking about before the shubha. Let's say the shubha is now starting to creep into the heart. So stop and seek refuge. Abu Hurairah narrates that shaitan will come to one of you and he will say, who created this, who created that? This is a very interesting hadith because the starting point is from a good place. You're actually out in nature and you're reflecting upon nature, let's say. And you're like, you're thinking like, wow, subhanAllah, Allah, made this beautiful sunset. And you're like, and He made the sun. And then, yes, He made the universe. That's shaitan coming to you. And then you keep going down that path. Who created this? Who created that? Who created Allah? All right, what's the advice? Open up the divine reality and start studying like the argument from dependency? No. We're not saying we don't have arguments, but again, it goes back to weak hearts, right? We're not saying there are not arguments there. What we're saying is, what is the advice from the greatest human being to walk the face of this earth, sallallahu alaihi wasallam? What did he say? Who created the Lord? When it comes to this, let him seek refuge in Allah and stop such thoughts. In another narration, let him say, Amantu billah, I have faith in Allah, right? I have iman in Allah, and just stop and move forward, right? Again, it doesn't mean that there are no answers. If you want to look at answers for atheism, there's plenty of answers. In fact, this very construct of asking who created this is problematic, right? But again, that's not what the Prophet ﷺ recommended. All right, so I'm going to skip that there. Number 3, to make the distinction. All right, so up there, we've got some really delicious, depending on your mood, berries. So let me ask you this, as a survey, how many people would take this first group of berries? Raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4. Anyone interested in the second group of berries? Nobody? So you're saying these berries look more delicious than these berries? Yes? Okay, anyone go to the third group of berries? A couple of hands. All right, fair enough. All right, here's the berries. So these are healthy grapes. So good job for the guys that wanted the healthy grapes, right? The other two, if you just looked at them and said, oh, that looks delicious, these are both poisonous, right? If you are not able to make the distinction, you would be in trouble in this case. So making distinction between what is a true shubha, what is a valid question, and what is called a waswasa, that becomes very, very important, okay? So let's take a look. First of all, a waswasa. In English, it's called a whisper. I'm going to skip that as well. Whisperings are thoughts that you do not agree with and do not believe, and you have a psychological aversion to before you start reading the hadith. Everyone has certain thoughts and certain things that come to them that you would not verbalize. Like crazy stuff that you think about, you're just like, whoa. Like it's just like, man. What you have to understand, and a lot of people, that lets them affect them. Like, how could I think such an abhorrent thought about this person, about myself, about the world, whatever it might be? I mean, they're really bad, right? Sometimes, like, comedians highlight them because obviously they don't have Islam to give them those boundaries, right? So, like, I was listening to one comedian, he's like, sometimes I'm driving in the car, and I'm just driving down the road, and I always think that if my hand, there's a whole sidewalk of people, if I just move my hand like 10 degrees this way, all of the mayhem it would cause, right? I mean, subhanAllah, in that context, it was supposed to be funny, whatever it is. The point is, people have these thoughts. But the thing is, if you have a natural kind of internal aversion towards these thoughts, we understand that, in fact, that is a sign of iman. Why? Because the Prophet ﷺ, in a hadith narrated by Abu Hurairah, he said, some of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ came, the Messenger of Allah, came and said, we find in ourselves thoughts that are too terrible to speak of. He said, are you really suffering from that? They said, yes. The Prophet ﷺ said that is a clear sign, sarih al-iman. It is a clear sign of iman, because you recognize the enormity of the thing, and then you don't even want to speak about it. That's not a negative thing, that's a positive thing, right? In another narration, truly Allah has overlooked for my ummah that which has been whispered, or that which is thought about in the lower self, as long as you do not act upon it and do not speak about it, all right? Point being is, when you have those whispers, those waswasas, as bad as they may be, as long as you don't act upon them and you don't speak about them, you've got to just disregard them, basically, right? And seek refuge with Allah. All right, how about valid questions? Here's the distinction between valid questions and shubuhat. Valid questions are not doubts that undermine your belief or lead you to distort Islam in some way. They do not have paradigmatic consequences. They're not going to undermine your worldview, how you look at the world, right? Even questions about the existence of Allah. The point is, what is your state when you're asking the question is what determines whether it's a doubt, a shubha, or it's a valid question. So if someone comes and says, to, let's say Sheikh Ahmed, he says, can you tell me what are some of the proofs for the existence of Allah? Or how do we know Allah exists? There's two states that the person could be asking that question. One, I'd like to know the proofs to help me in my da'wah, let's say. I want to call people to Islam. How do we establish this? Or two, I'm not really sure if Allah exists. One is a shubha, one is a valid question. But notice, the question itself could be the same. The thing that's different is the state of the person asking it, right? So to be able to recognize that, because you don't want to be in a state where you're not asking valid questions for the fear of a shubha, right? And vice versa. You don't want to assume that everything is a valid question, no matter what the state of your heart is, right? So making the distinction becomes extremely, extremely important. All right. So the point is, there's nothing wrong with asking valid questions. The Sahaba had questions. The Quran mentions this. Yas'alunaka. You hear this term over and over and over again in the Quran. Yas'alunaka anir ruh. They ask you concerning the soul. They ask you, and so on. Nothing wrong with asking valid questions. It's the distinction that's important here. So, if we are sincere and believe in Islam, do not doubt the fundamentals, then those questions are not doubts. All right. What are doubts? The falsehood that undermines the fundamentals of Islam or distorts the religion in any way. To be unsure about the truth about the fundamentals. And here, we're taking fundamentals to equate to what we're talking about, worldview, right? Or paradigm. Fair enough? Everyone good? Yes. Yeah. Right. So what I'm saying is that you are the one that's going to assess what perspective that question is coming from, right? If you're in the perspective of saying, I'm not sure about the validity of Islam as a worldview, as a paradigm, right? And then you're asking the question, it means that there's a different state that you're in, right? As opposed to just saying, I'm sure about the fundamentals. I know Islam is absolutely true, but I have this question. That's a valid question. Yes? Yes. So ask, but again, a lot of that's going to depend on the state of your heart too. Questions you ask will increase your iman, because we have a section in here called Study Islam. So definitely, the Sahaba had questions, but they didn't have questions about undermining their iman. They didn't come to the Prophet ﷺ and say, well, I'm not sure about Islam, so can you please prove to me X, Y, and Z? Right? But they did have questions. And sometimes those questions were about theology and aqidah, right? They weren't just questions about fiqh, for instance. Yeah. So here's the thing. It's not about it being bad to ask questions, but then you have to be ready to hear the paradigmatic responses. Yeah. In other words, if you ask me the question, okay, let's say this particular hadith, like I don't really understand it. Just whatever the hadith is. My response to you as someone that does this, like as a mentor, I don't know if I'd go straight into the hadith and be, let me explain it to you. I'd probably try to investigate, all right, hold on a second. Let's go back to ontology and epistemology and all of those other questions before we get to the hadith, right? So it's not, the problem isn't the asking of the questions, right? But for you as an individual, this is for you and dealing with your own doubts, right? If it's coming from a position of doubts, you can refer back to, why is this affecting my worldview? Does it have something to do with the ontology? Does it have something to do with the epistemology? Am I doubting the sources of knowledge? Is it a problem with teleology? What do I assume that my purpose in life is? And so on and so forth, right? But if you ignore all of that, that's where the problem arises. Make sense? Okay. All right. Number 4, your environment. And I'll be really honest. This one's like a no-brainer. But most people, they may not think about it. All right. So before I get in, I don't want to spend too much time on the studies from social psychology. I'll just mention one real quick because I'm not going to be able to cover all of them. What we're talking about here is conformity. In other words, the people around you and your environment around you has a deep influence on you, okay? Now again, this is like a no-brainer. If you're a parent, you know this immediately, okay? But if you want to bolster it with, studies from social psychology, there was one that was done by Solomon Asch in 1951. It's kind of the foundational study in this area, and where you have other studies on conformity. Solomon Asch, basically, he brought in individuals, and they had a couple of lines. Actually, I may have a slide on that. Yeah, there we go, the Solomon Asch study, the line experiment. So he has this chart, and he asks the person that comes in this line, I, which line is it closest to, A, B, or C? Now the correct answer is B. Now when the person was brought in, like what they call the innocent participant, they would answer the question. Now they did another study where they would bring in an innocent participant who didn't know, and you would have stooges, basically people that were in on the experiment. And they would tell the stooges, don't say that the line that's closest to I is B, but rather say it's C. And the innocent participant was asked almost last. So what the studies basically showed was that even though these participants may have answered the question correctly in one context, with people around them, I think it was at like a 63% change, where they would say, no, you know what? It wasn't B, it's actually C. And everyone, you know this. When you go out to a restaurant, if you're in a corporate setting, and let's say you go to Cheesecake Factory. Any Cheesecake Factory fans here? Too high in calories? Everyone else, I guess you and I are the only ones that don't care about the 5,000 calories. Like, you bring the cheesecake. All right, you go out to Cheesecake Factory, and you're with your coworkers, and maybe your boss is there, right? And so, what happens is after you have dinner or lunch or whatever it is, that waiter comes up and asks you that monumental question: would anyone like dessert? Now, what happens is, if you're at the end and everyone before you says no, are you really going to be the person be like, you know what? Forget all y'all. I'll have that cheesecake. Most likely not, right? Most likely like, man, if no one else, I don't think so, right? Social conformity. That's a clear example of it. Similarly, if you're a parent, your kid comes home and they're like, look, I can go to Johnny's house or I can go to Michael's house, all right? Johnny, yeah, he's good. He's getting, D's in school. He's got some family problems, whatever it might be. But Michael here, straight A student, on his way to Harvard. Very respectful, comes over and says, Mr. Taslim, have a nice day, really nice to meet you, very intellectually sharp. Who do you want your child to hang out with? The straight A student, right? Now you might say, well, that's being biased and blah, 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 whatever. Okay, fine, but as a parent, you're not worried about that. You're not worried about your child because you understand social conformity intuitively, right? So your environment has a deep impact on on your doubts, basically. If you're around people that are constantly spewing out doubts and saying, well, what about this? What about that? That's going to have an effect on you, all right? Now, I don't want to belabor this point because I've got 10 more minutes. The point is, if you're looking for, let me just mention one other thing, and that is, and many of you might have already know this, in Surah Al-Kahf, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions a dog. The dog that accompanied the youth in the cave? And the question, and you would have thought that they were awake, though they were asleep. We turned them over to right and left, while their dog stretched his forelegs at the entrance. Had you looked at them, you would have certainly fled away from them filled with horror. So the question arises, why did Allah mention the dog? Think about it this way. From the time the ayah was revealed until the day of judgment, people will be reciting about that dog all over the world. Allah didn't mention me in the Quran, didn't mention you in the Quran, He mentioned this dog in the Quran. Why? No. He mentioned the dog as Ibn Kathir mentions. He says their dog was included in their blessing, so he slept as they slept in that situation. This is the benefit of keeping company with righteous people. So this dog was mentioned and given the status to. It was because of the company he kept. The sohbah the dog had. Righteous people, right? So your environment has a deep impact. So to look at your environment. If you're suffering through doubts, sometimes it's important to take yourself out of the environment that you're in. And it can be hard, but it might be necessary. Okay. And then we've got prophetic advice, al-maru ala dini khalili, a person is upon the deen, worldview of his close friend, so be aware of your friend. Of course, I'm sure you guys are aware of the hadith of the blacksmith versus the perfume seller and so on and so forth. So, point number 5, and this might be the last one because I only have 10 minutes, and I want to kind of stress this a little bit. Point number 5, or strategy number 5, is to study Islam. All right, I'm going to move over from the etymology of this, light as a parable, and come to a certain dua of the Prophet ﷺ. And the reason I'm bringing up this particular hadith and this particular dua is to highlight the point about the difference between studying Islam and just studying. Like, you can study a lot of things. You can study organic chemistry. Any organic chemistry fans? No? Okay. I used to be, believe it or not, but I stopped. All right. Or studying math, or studying geology, or whatever it is that you're studying. I know I'm mentioning physical science, but even history, economics, whatever it might be, right? There's a different dynamic. And I wanted to highlight it by way of this hadith. One of the interesting things about hadith that you'll find is sometimes there's a rabt between the things that the Prophet ﷺ is talking about. There's a connection between them. So this hadith has 4 elements that the Prophet ﷺ is seeking refuge with Allah, right? Seeking Allah's protection from. What are the 4 elements? So, O Allah, I seek refuge in you from a knowledge that does not benefit. Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min ilmin la yanfa' wa min qalbin la yakhsha'. From a heart that is not reverent. Wa min nafsin la tashba'. From a soul that is not content. Wa min da'watin la yustajibu laha. And from a dua that is not answered. So let's start with the first one. Knowledge that has no benefit. Scholars mention that there's 2 categories of this knowledge. One is knowledge that does not benefit you in the dunya or in the akhirah. Does not benefit you in the temporal world, nor does it benefit you in the akhirah. And so classical books, they give examples. Like, I think one of the examples they give is genealogy, like just to memorize people's genealogy. So at one point, it had a certain benefit, but then it just became something people would do in vogue. Like, you would show off like how well your genealogy, your ability to memorize lists of people being related to other people. That's not a good example for, modern 21st century Sugar Land, Texas, to be honest. So I was thinking, what's a good example of knowledge that does not benefit you in the dunya, does not benefit you in the akhirah? And I think I came up with a good example. The example that I have are sports statistics. Right? Like, I mean, people, when they know things, it's just like, my own kids, I don't want to pick on anyone, but I mean, like Ibrahim, right? He knows stuff that I'm just like, why do you care, right? Like, who cares what Brady's statistics are, right? But he knows everything from like every single Super Bowl he won, the rings that he has, what were his stats, what touchdowns, catches, and blah, I don't even know the terminology, right? I'm just like, yo, this is ilm la yanfa. This is knowledge that's not going to benefit you at all, right? So this is the first category. The scholars say it's not going to benefit you here, it's not going to benefit you in the dunya. Now, I don't want to say, just to qualify, I'm not saying it's haram or anything like that, to know sports statistics. That's not the point, right? So, but just as an example. Second type of knowledge that has no benefit is knowledge of Islam that you do not implement. Because then it just becomes empty information, right? That's why Imam Ahmad said, whenever you hear a hadith, make sure you pay the zakat of the hadith. And he said, what were you referring to? In other words, that you act upon it. There's a zakat that's due on every hadith you learn, right? And he was very stringent about this. So the first type of knowledge has no benefit. We said that's no knowledge of this dunya and the akhirah that has no benefit, and knowledge of Islam that you do not implement. That's number 1. Number 2, the second part of the hadith, from a heart that is not reverent, from a heart that has no khushu'a. Anyone know what the term khushu'a means? What does it mean? Sincerity? Okay. Anybody else? Feeling comfort? Okay. What else? Shaykh, come on, help us out. Khushu'a. Ma mana khushu'a? Focus? Okay. What else? Khushu'a, man. Come on, guys. We're in a masjid here. Sorry? Feeling connected. Okay. Fair enough. Fear. Okay. So fear is a good one. Heart that cries. Poetry here, mashallah. I like it. Yeah, you were going to say. Pleased. Okay. Anyone else? Calm, pleased. Anybody else? Genuine. Okay. So all of those are really good answers. Khushu'a, when we boil it down, we try to think about it, it has elements of all of those things. It even has elements of fear, as was mentioned. But not the fear like a horror movie fear. That's not what we're talking about. Okay? So a concept that might be closer would be what you might call in English awe. So like if you see like this, you go to the Grand Canyon and you look down and you see you're in a state of awe. Now you have a type of fear, but not fear like, oh my God, Michael Myers is coming to kill me. Not that kind of fear. But the fear that's like, it's just overwhelming, something greater than you, and your heart is in that state of awe, okay? That's one aspect of khushu'ah. Another aspect of khushu'ah is the concept of khashiyah, in the sense that you can have a type of fear of disappointing someone. In the sense that like a husband could have the fear of disappointing his wife, or vice versa, right? You don't want to do something that would be the displeasure of that person, so you have khashiyah, okay? So these concepts are related. So the Prophet ﷺ is asking for a heart, to protection from a heart that has no khushu'ah. It has this type of fear and awe and sincerity, that it's missing all of that. That's number 2. Number 3, a soul that is not content, meaning that you constantly want more and more and more, right? So you've got the brand new Tesla. 3 days later, you're like, it's not that great. I want the self-driving Tesla. Whatever it is, right? So you keep on wanting more. So a soul that has no contentment, a nafs that is not content. The last one is a dua that is not answered. Is there any type of dua that's not answered? Harming someone else? I mean, assuming it's a good dua, let's say, right? Obviously, you're not going to get something where you're like, oh, let me murder him or whatever. That's not, that's obvious, but yeah. It's still answered, though. So I'm not talking about, we're saying that one is not answered.
Yeah, I'm saying, but I think your God is answered.
Okay, so you're saying that, okay, yeah.
Since what your perceptive classifications?
Okay, maybe. What do you think? Yeah, bizabt. So, right. Yeah. Yes. So the hadith that was mentioned was about a traveler who's out in the desert. They say, I think the ulama mentioned that he's out on something good, like Hajj or Jihad or something like that. So he's out in some sort of something, and something happens, and he calls out, Rabbi, Rabbi. And the Prophet ﷺ says, how will Allah answer his dua when his earning is haram, his spending is haram, his food is, everything is haram? How will Allah answer his dua? Okay? And he says that this is a dua that basically would not be answered. Now, let's bring it back to this particular hadith. So, first of all, if knowledge that is not beneficial, we mentioned what that is. What is beneficial knowledge? Beneficial knowledge is knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Who Allah is, that sort of deeper connection. When a person knows Allah, what is the state of their heart? They have khushu'ah. It increases their khushu'ah, okay? Now, let's take it from the other side. A dua that is not answered is when you're earning and you're spending, it's haram, right? Why would that be the case? Why that's the case is because a soul that's not content. You want more and more and more, so it doesn't matter whether it's halal or haram at a certain point, so you just keep on wanting more and more, and that's why you're halal and haram. You're not worried about it, right? When that happens, now you've got a soul that is not content, and that leads to a heart that is not reverent. Because if it's missing that knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's not going to have khushu'ah. If it's not going to have khushu'ah, it's not going to be content. If it's not going to be content, it doesn't matter whether it's halal or haram, and boom, your du'as are not answered. So all 4 of these concepts are linked together like this, right? And this is just one hadith and one dua of the Prophet ﷺ. Now the point that I'm trying to make with this hadith is that this is not about just gaining information. This is about being and having to change the person internally. And hence, the Prophet ﷺ is linking knowledge with other spiritual concepts. And you see this throughout the entire Islamic paradigm. When you go through the Quran, every place you see knowledge mentioned, you will see something mentioned about spirituality. So studying Islam is not just about gaining knowledge, but it's about you changing yourself and changing your being by way of spirituality itself. And that's why when the companions were described, they said they had knowledge upon action and action upon knowledge, right? Or spirituality, piety upon action and action upon, piety upon knowledge and knowledge upon piety. Knowledge would cause them to be more pious. Being more pious would cause them to open doors of knowledge. And so it would be like a cyclical relationship. And that's why studying Islam, when it comes to shubuhat, becomes very important. Because you're not studying it in a vacuum. You're studying it from a paradigmatic perspective. Right? Does that make sense? Anyways, so I think that's the time. The course itself gets into more examples of this, and we do some case studies. The 2 case studies, one is women's inheritance and one is the age of consent, but we're out of time. So that being the case, I'm going to go and stop here. You guys look tired and perhaps hungry. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless all of you. If there was any sort of benefit, it's all from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Anything that was a mistake, or if you were offended or triggered or anything like that, that was all from me and from shaitan. JazakAllahkhair. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.